January 24, 1948. Montelupich Prison, Krakow, Poland. Erich Musfeldt walks toward the gallows where he will be hanged. The former SS member was responsible for unimaginable atrocities. He burned people alive, threw children into gas chambers, and oversaw mass executions in concentration camps. But who was the man behind the uniform? What turned him into one of the Holocaust's cruelest executioners? And why was his body donated to science after his death? Stay to the end to learn how the story of one of Auschwitz's cruelest and most hated monsters came to an end. Before we begin, we are working toward our goal of 1 million subscribers. It may seem far away, but with your help, we can get there. Subscribe now, leave a like, and become part of this story. Who was Erich Musfeldt? The making of a criminal. Erich Musfeldt was born on February 18, 1913, in the quiet town of Neubrück, then part of the vast German Empire. It was an unremarkable place of peaceful streets and working-class families. Nothing suggested that one of the most feared figures in the Nazi extermination camp system would grow up there. The son of a laborer, Musfeldt had an apparently normal childhood. His family had limited means, but also the stability typical of Germany's working class at the time. He completed 8 years of basic schooling, and at 17 he trained as a baker, a humble but honest trade that promised a life of routine and hard work. He married young and had a son. For a time, he seemed destined for an ordinary life, marked by neither great achievements nor great tragedies. So how did this modest man, a simple small-town baker, become one of the Nazi regime's most sadistic executioners? The answer to that dark transformation begins with a decisive date in the history of Germany and the world. On January 30, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of the Reich. At the time, millions saw the new leader as the promise of national redemption, economic recovery, and restored pride. Erich Musfeldt was one of them. Later that same year, the young baker left his ovens and dough behind and joined the SA, the Sturmabteilung, or Stormtroopers, a paramilitary organization that served as the Nazi Party's violent arm on the streets. What began as an act of political allegiance and social opportunism would soon become something far deeper and darker. In 1937, Musfeldt took a decisive step in his rise through the regime when he transferred to the SS, the feared Schutzstaffel, the ideological and repressive elite of the Third Reich. 2 years later, in 1939, he officially joined the Nazi Party, sealing his commitment to the machinery of violence and death taking shape in Germany. Musfeldt was not forced. At no point was he dragged into this path or coerced. He took every step of his own accord, driven by ambition, ideological conviction, or perhaps the sadistic pleasure he would later display. When the Second World War broke out on September 1, 1939, Erich Musfeldt finally found an environment in which he could flourish. In January 1940, he was assigned to the SS Totenkopf Division, the infamous Death's Head units. Created by Theodor Eicke in 1934, these units wore the skull and crossbones on their uniforms, not as an ornament, but as a symbol of their role in administering concentration and extermination camps. These men were indoctrinated to hold human life in absolute contempt. They were trained in blind discipline, brutal obedience, and systematic habitat. They were machines programmed to kill, torture, and subjugate, and Erich Musfeldt fit the mold perfectly. In August 1940, the most brutal phase of his career began. He was sent to Auschwitz, which was still being established, but would soon become the epicenter of the genocide in Europe. There, he held positions of authority, commanding forced labor details and serving as a block leader. Those positions gave him power, and he wielded it with the utmost brutality. His reputation soon preceded him. Even among the Nazis, some regarded his behavior as gratuitously cruel. He always carried a solid wooden club, not as a means of restraint, but as an extension of his brutality. He beat prisoners until they lost consciousness, sometimes for no reason at all. A look, a stance, a gesture he considered insolent, that was enough. On one occasion, Musfeldt saw a prisoner smiling at a cart driver, an act so simple, so human, and flew into an uncontrollable rage. With a single punch, he broke the prisoner's jaw. He then kicked him repeatedly and shattered 3 of his teeth. The reason? None, beyond the pleasure of inflicting pain. In another, even more brutal episode, he beat a prisoner until the man collapsed, utterly powerless. But he did not stop there. Musfeldt seized the handle of a shovel and rammed it into the victim's throat, watching coldly as the man died in agony. Can you imagine such cruelty? Beating a defenseless man and killing him slowly, not out of revenge, not out of personal hatred, but simply because he could, simply because he was in control. And this was only the beginning of Erich Musfeldt's path through the horrors of the Holocaust. Transferred to Majdanek, November 1941. Winter was already beginning to cover occupied Poland with its gray mantle when Erich Musfeldt was transferred to the Majdanek concentration camp on the outskirts of Lublin. There, he assumed an even more sinister position than the one he had held at Auschwitz. He became head of the crematorium. It was the perfect position for someone like him, a post where death was not merely routine, but a spectacle, where power over life and pain became absolute. At Majdanek, Erich Musfeldt's sadistic nature would flourish to its fullest. He walked through the camp with the arrogance of a predator, looking prisoners in the eye as though choosing his prey. Many reported that he would approach without warning and whisper coldly, "I'll get you soon. I'm warning you. I'll burn you alive." This was no empty threat. It was a death sentence, and Musfeldt carried out every word. Among the cruelest cases was that of a young Polish woman approximately 20 years old. When she discovered that she was to be sent to the gas chamber, she fell into despair. She screamed, wept, and tried to resist. In a moment of desperate courage, she scratched Musfeldt's face and, through her tears, cried, "Why do I have to die?" His answer was immediate, emotionless, and without hesitation. "You will be burned alive." The sentence was carried out with unimaginable coldness. The young woman's hands and feet were tied. Then her body was fastened to the metal cart used to transport corpses to the furnace. Still alive, she was pushed into the flames. As her screams mingled with the crackling wood and the muffled sound of fire devouring human flesh, Musfeldt watched impassively, smiling. This was not madness. It was pure sadism. The mind of someone who saw another person's suffering not as an obstacle, but as a source of pleasure. For Musfeldt, pain was a spectacle. Death was entertainment. But the worst, the most brutal, and the most devastating in sheer numbers was still to come. In October 1943, he was appointed one of the central figures in Aktion Erntefest, or Operation Harvest Festival, an ironic, almost cynical name that concealed the mission's true purpose: the systematic annihilation of the Jews still alive in camps such as Majdanek, Poniatowa, and Travniki. For weeks, Jewish prisoners were forced to dig trenches under the pretense that they would be used as air raid defenses. But deep down, those digging knew the bitter truth. They were digging their own graves. Imagine the psychological terror. Every shovelful of earth cast aside brought them one step closer to death. Every meter they dug brought the end nearer. There was no escape. There was no hope of rescue. The killing began on the 3rd of November, 1943, and continued into the following day. Approximately 43,000 Jews were executed in just 2 days, shot in groups inside the trenches they had dug themselves. It was the largest massacre of Jews carried out in a single operation during the entire Holocaust. To drown out the gunfire and screams, the Nazis placed loudspeakers throughout the camps and played classical music at high volume. Death danced to the sound of waltzes, marches, and German choral music. And Erich Musfeldt was there, at the center of it all, supervising the killing, ordering executions, and watching blood flow through trenches cut into the mud. Accounts describe him smiling and smoking, as though he were watching a carefully staged performance. In that scene of absolute horror, Musfeldt was not merely an executioner. He was a conductor of death. And his involvement with death was far from over. Majdanek would be only one of many stages on which he left his bloody mark. The height of horror, the return to Auschwitz. By May 1944, smoke was already rising steadily from the crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau when Erich Musfeldt returned to the deadliest extermination camp of the Nazi regime. But this time, he would not serve in a secondary role. He was assigned to oversee the Birkenau crematoria directly, just as hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were arriving to be murdered en masse. Auschwitz was the beating heart of the Nazi machinery of genocide. Birkenau, its extension, was the epicenter of the extermination campaign. Every day, packed trains arrived there carrying men, women, and children to their deaths. And it was there that Musfeldt became master of the flames. Can you imagine what it was like to work under the orders of a man like him? His subordinates eagerly followed his example. They were seen beating women to death with wooden clubs. One of Musfeldt's favorite pastimes was whipping prisoners' backs until the flesh split open. Witnesses said he smiled as prisoners were dragged away and thrown into the blazing furnaces, sometimes while they were still alive. But Musfeldt's cruelty knew no limits and made no exceptions. One of the most sickening episodes recorded by survivors involved Jewish children brought from the Warsaw Ghetto. After being separated from their parents, they caused a commotion during the head count. They cried, called for their mothers, and clung to one another, as any children would in the face of such terror. Musfeldt's response was immediate: fury. Without hesitation, he ordered that they all be taken directly to the gas chambers. No registration, no mercy, only the cold decision to extinguish innocent lives. Pause for a moment and think about that. They were children, small, defenseless, terrified human beings. Children who dreamed, who sang, who held their parents' hands in fear. And to Musfeldt, they deserved to die for causing a commotion. One of the most valuable accounts of Erich Musfeldt's character comes from Miklos Niszli, a Hungarian Jewish physician forced to work at Auschwitz. Niszli performed autopsies connected with Joseph Mengele's experiments, bringing him into constant contact with the machinery of death. Musfeldt often visited the doctor. They talked about politics and the war like two colleagues in an ordinary workplace. An executioner in the morning, a gentleman in the afternoon. During one such encounter, just after shooting 80 prisoners in the back of the head, Musfeldt complained of high blood pressure. Trying to preserve some shred of humanity, Niszli asked whether it might be related to the executions. Musfeldt's answer was brutal. "It makes no difference whether I killed 1 or 80. If my blood pressure is high, it is because I drank too much." That statement says it all. To him, death was a statistic. Murder was routine. Human suffering was irrelevant. Niszli also recorded an extraordinary case. A 16-year-old girl was found alive after surviving a gas chamber. She was weak, but she was breathing. It was an almost impossible miracle. The doctor cared for her and tried to stabilize her. In a rare appeal, he asked Musfeldt to spare her life. It was an opportunity for compassion, an exception, a possible spark of humanity. Musfeldt listened, considered the request for a moment, and replied, "There is no way around it. The child will have to die." 30 minutes later, the girl was killed by a shot to the back of the head. A miracle had become an execution. And Musfeldt smiled. It was not a nervous smile, nor the smile of a man concealing his guilt. It was the calm smile of someone who delighted in the suffering of others. He walked among the crematoria like a farmer walking his fields, choosing, pointing, deciding who would live another day and who would be cast into the flames. On days when the pace of killing slowed, he selected the weakest prisoners to be hanged from hooks in the walls. Death was his instrument of control, and he wanted to keep it active and constant, like a machine that could never be allowed to stop. The survivor Jerzy Lang witnessed one of the most disturbing scenes of the entire Holocaust. He saw Muhsfeldt walking calmly toward the crematorium, carrying 2 Jewish children, one in each hand, as casually as if he were carrying bags, as if they were objects, not people. Soon afterward, gunshots rang out. To drown out the screams, the Nazis started the engine of a truck, the same one used to transport bodies to the forest, where they were burned whenever the ovens could not keep pace with the volume of corpses. The engine drowned out the screams, but it could not conceal the truth. For all these acts, for burning people alive, executing innocent people, and overseeing the murder of hundreds of thousands, the Third Reich awarded Erich Musfeldt the War Merit Cross, 2nd class. Yes, he was decorated. In the regime's twisted logic, he was a hero, an efficient officer, a defender of the fatherland. Muhsfeldt wore the medal with pride. To him, it represented honor, merit, and duty fulfilled. In the mind of a psychopath, genocide was merely a measure of competence. But the end was drawing near. The liberation of Majdanek, July 1944. Soviet troops were advancing rapidly through occupied Poland. Then, amid the dust and the stench of death, the Red Army liberated the Majdanek concentration camp. Unlike other camps, Majdanek had not been destroyed by the fleeing Nazis. It remained almost intact, barracks still standing, crematorium ovens still visible, documents scattered everywhere, piles of shoes, human hair, ashes, and bones that had not been fully burned. It was stark evidence of the Nazi genocide, a scene that could not be denied, a horror laid bare before the world. Fewer than 500 Jews were still alive, men, women, and children. Emaciated and traumatized, they had survived by chance. All had been left behind in the Nazis' haste to conceal the traces of their crimes. But Erich Musfeldt was no longer there. As we have already seen, he had been transferred back to Auschwitz 2 months earlier. Even as the Third Reich began to collapse, Musfeldt continued working tirelessly within its machinery of death. Time, however, was running out. The Soviet advance was accelerating, the fronts were breaking, and Hitler's empire was beginning to crumble. In August 1944, as the pressure mounted, Erich Musfeldt was sent to the front amid fierce fighting on Hungarian soil. There, he temporarily exchanged the crematoria for crossfire, not out of conviction, but because of military necessity. He was wounded in combat, and the regime, still loyal to its heroes, transferred him to Flossenbürg concentration camp in southern Germany in April 1945. He was wounded, but still fit for duty. Even in the war's final phase, with chaos spreading in every direction, Musfeldt did not change. His cruelty persisted as though the Third Reich were still at the height of its power. In the final days at Flossenbürg, as the Allies drew ever closer, the Nazis organized a mass evacuation, forcing prisoners to march for kilometers into the German interior. As at other camps, these evacuations became death marches. Those who fell, fainted, or could go no farther were summarily executed. Witnesses stated without hesitation that Erich Musfeldt was among those pulling the trigger. During the evacuation, he was seen coldly shooting dozens of sick or weakened prisoners, men who could barely remain standing, let alone walk. There was no trial, no compassion, only gunfire, only death. Until the very end, with Germany collapsing and the regime's downfall at the door, Musfeldt continued to kill, as though he knew nothing else, as though the blood of others were the only language he understood. But not even he could escape forever. The day would soon come when Musfeldt would stop giving orders and start receiving them. Are you enjoying the story so far? Have you subscribed? Don't forget to like the video and enable notifications so you'll know whenever a new one is released. And to help more people discover our work, leave a comment below saying, "I want more stories." It motivates us to keep producing videos like this and signals to the platforms that the content is relevant, helping us reach an even wider audience. Now, let us continue the story of Nazi criminal Erich Musfeldt. The fall of Nazi Germany, the capture of Erich Musfeldt. May 1945. After years of terror, the Third Reich was finally collapsing beneath the wreckage of its own lies. Adolf Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen to the Red Army. All that remained of the Nazi Empire was ruin, despair, and corpses. With the war over, attention turned to the survivors and to their tormentors. There was nowhere left to hide. Erich Musfeldt, the man who had overseen crematoria, executed children, and selected people for life or death as casually as if they were disposable objects, was finally captured by the Allies. After years of wielding absolute power over life and death, he was now just another prisoner of war, disarmed, handcuffed, and powerless. Imagine the shock. The man who had once strutted among the furnaces of Birkenau, ordering deaths with a flick of his finger, now waited in silence for his next meal and his captor's commands. From absolute power to utter insignificance. In January 1947, Muhsfeldt faced his first trial. An American military tribunal was convened to try crimes committed at the Flossenburg concentration camp, particularly during the final days of the war, when prisoners were shot as they were forced onto death marches. Courageous witnesses came forward to describe what they had seen. Muhsfeldt beating sick prisoners with the butt of his gun, coldly shooting those who could no longer walk in the back, and the empty, sometimes even satisfied expression of a man who killed as naturally as he breathed. The sentence was unequivocal: life imprisonment. But this was only the beginning of the reckoning. The Polish authorities knew exactly who Erich Musfeldt was. They knew about his past at Auschwitz and Majdanek. They knew about Aktion Erntefest, the harvest festival operation, the cremation furnaces, the children, and the executions. Above all, they knew that his gravest crimes had been committed on Polish soil. Poland, therefore, demanded his extradition, and the Americans agreed. Shortly after his conviction by an American military tribunal, Musfeldt was taken to Poland, where he would face a far broader and more forceful prosecution. This time, he would not be tried merely for killing prisoners who tried to escape. He would be tried as one of the central figures in the Nazi machinery of extermination. The stage was set. The Auschwitz Tribunal, established specifically to try those responsible for crimes committed at the camp, was preparing to deliver justice. Now, the man who had once smiled as he threw children into the flames would have to listen, one by one, to the voices of the survivors. History was about to deliver its verdict. The trial in Poland began on November 24, 1947. In a packed courtroom in Krakow, Auschwitz survivors came face to face with the perpetrators who had served at the largest extermination camp in history. The proceedings would last exactly 1 month. In the dock were 41 former members of the Auschwitz staff, men and women who had voluntarily served the Nazi machinery of extermination. One name in particular stood out: Erich Musfeldt. It was a moment many had thought would never come. The moment when the man who had supervised crematoria, executed children, and walked over corpses would finally face the consequences of his choices. During the trial, the court heard devastating accounts. Survivors described in detail the scenes they had witnessed: summary executions, beatings, and sadistic smiles. The posthumous testimony of Miklos Nizhly completed the portrait of a cold, methodical man incapable of remorse. Nizhly was a Hungarian Jewish physician who had been forced to work at Auschwitz, performing autopsies connected with Joseph Mengele's experiments, and had known Musfeldt there. But what shocked the judges most was not just the testimony, it was Musfeldt's own words. During the war, he had told a Polish political prisoner, If you Poles weren't so stupid, we wouldn't have to burn you in the crematoria. It was more than a confession. It was proof that Muhsfeldt did not see his victims as victims. To him, they deserved to die. That statement sealed his fate. No defense could erase its moral meaning. On December 22, 1947, after a month of hearings, the court convened to deliver its verdict. Of the 41 defendants, 23 were sentenced to death by hanging. Erich Musfeldt was among them. The Supreme National Tribunal of Poland found him guilty of crimes against humanity. It was the most symbolic verdict of all. The man who had sent thousands to their deaths in the crematoria would now face the same fate. He spent his final days in Montelupich prison in Krakow, the same prison where the Nazis had executed dozens of Polish resistance fighters during the occupation. The place carried a heavy symbolic weight. History's justice asserted itself with bitter irony. The executioner now stood in the place of his victims. There is no record of repentance, no expression of remorse, and no attempt at redemption. Even in the face of death, Erich Musfeldt seemed incapable of grasping the enormity of the crimes he had committed. January 24, 1948. It was a cold morning in Krakow. Erich Musfeldt woke for the last time. He was only 34, still young, but he had already lived long enough to destroy countless lives. Led into the prison yard, he walked in silence. There is no record of any final words. Perhaps he tried to say something. Perhaps he maintained the same arrogant silence that had accompanied him throughout his life. The executioner tightened the rope around his neck. For several seconds, the two men stared at each other. That exchange of glances carried the full weight of history. The man who had once been the executioner was now the one being executed. But there was one crucial difference. His victims had been innocent. He was not. The trapdoor opened, and Erich Musfeldt's body fell. He endured several minutes of agony, the same kind of agony he had so often inflicted on others, without hesitation and without mercy. Shortly afterward, he was pronounced dead. At last, justice had been done. But fate still had one final chapter in store for him. Following a common practice at the time, Musfeldt's body was donated to the University of Krakow for use as teaching material in anatomy classes. The man who had destroyed thousands of human bodies was himself dissected in the name of science. The destroyer of human lives now served, however unwillingly, to help save others. It was the final insult, the last blow to the memory of a man who had spent his life reducing human beings to ashes. And he ended as a nameless body on a dissecting table. Thus fell Erich Musfeldt, and although he had sent thousands to hell, he himself did not escape the final judgment. The legacy. According to the testimony of Miklos Niesli, the shadow of destruction cast by Erich Musfeldt ultimately engulfed his own family. His wife was killed in an Allied air raid. His son was sent to the Eastern Front and never returned. His fate remains uncertain to this day, but he almost certainly died in the frozen snows of the Soviet Union, like so many other young men sacrificed to Nazi ideology. The violence Musfeldt helped cultivate, with every punch, every bullet, every body cast into the flames, surely consumed those he was supposed to protect as well. In the end, no one remained, no friend came, no relative pleaded for mercy. There were no letters, no appeals, no tears. He died as he had lived, alone, devoid of humanity, remorse, or redemption. And although his story ended on the gallows in Krakow, it continues to echo as a grim reminder. Evil can gather strength. It can prosper for a time, but it never escapes justice. No matter how long it takes or how distant it may seem, justice comes. Erich Musfeldt believed he would never be punished. He believed he could burn people alive, oversee mass murder, exterminate children, and continue living under the protection of the Reich, decorated with medals and respected by his superiors. He was wrong. Today, more than 75 years later, the name Erich Musfeldt is not remembered with reverence. It is remembered with revulsion. He is studied as a symbol of systematic cruelty, the banality of evil, and cowardice disguised as authority. He wanted to be feared. He wanted to be admired within the Nazi system. Instead, he became an example of what it means to abandon one's humanity. Meanwhile, the victims he tried to erase from history, men, women, and children, remain alive in collective memory. They are remembered as heroes, as martyrs, and as human beings who retained their dignity, their faith, and their love for one another, even amid absolute terror. Their names are inscribed on memorials. Their faces are preserved in photographs, museums, books, and hearts. Their stories are told to educate, to warn, and to ensure that it never happens again. The executioner was forgotten. The victims were immortalized.
This is true justice. What did you think of today's story? Had you heard of Erich Musfeldt before? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to check that you're subscribed, turn on notifications, and of course, leave a like. Now enjoy the recommended video appearing on your screen. It's incredible.